She didn't bring a prayer or a ring, just bread and two boys who hadn't eaten in days. When Miriam stepped onto the dust-worn roads of Dry Willow, no one offered help, not until she reached a hilltop cabin, knocked once, and said, "I'll cook, I'll clean, just feed them." The man who opened that door, half Choctaw, half forgotten, said nothing, but he lifted her son and let them in. Now, with a burned barn, cold mornings, and the law at their backs, they've built something fierce and quiet. Will it hold, or will the world tear it down again? Sometimes a wooden whistle is the only answer. If you've ever built a home from nothing but grit, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe for more frontier stories. The wagon didn't stop for long in Dry Willow, just enough time for the driver to toss down a burlap sack, two boys and a woman with no shoes, and a crust of bread wrapped in a handkerchief. Dust swirled around Miriam Ames's hem as she bent to help her youngest Sam, age 5, off the wheel rim. Her older boy, Jesse, 10, and silent, was already tugging the sack out of the dirt, like he was the man of the family now. "Come on," Miriam said, voice hoarse from wind and worry. "We walk." They walked, past the mercantile where the clerk shut the door before she stepped on the stoop, past the church where the bell rope hung, stiff, unused. No one spoke. Dry Willow didn't take kindly to surprises, especially those with sunken cheeks and no husbands. Miriam wasn't expecting kindness. She was looking for something else. A fence, a name, a man who hadn't set foot in town for 3 winters, not since the bounty was lifted and the rumors died cold. 8 miles north, the land turned mean and sloped. The boys slowed. Miriam didn't. She kept her eyes on the ridge where scrub oak lined a narrow split in the hills and a lone chimney puffed faint smoke into the pale sky. Sam whimpered once. Jesse offered him the last bite of bread. Miriam didn't stop it. By the time they reached the gate, her legs ached, and her skirt clung to her with sweat. The fence was cedar old but mended, and the gate swung easy on the hinge. Beyond it stood a cabin tucked low in the ridge, half swallowed by wild vine. The door was shut. A rusted axe leaned against a stump. No chickens. No welcome. Miriam squared her shoulders. "Stay here," she told the boys. She didn't knock. She stood a few steps from the porch, hands folded tight in front of her eyes, fixed on the door. "I know who you are," she said, not loud, but clear. "I know what they say. I'm not here for trouble. I got 2 boys, no home, and no strength left to beg. Nothing stirred. I won't ask questions, won't ask favors. I'll cook, I'll clean. I won't speak if you don't want me to. But if you'll feed them," her voice cracked. She swallowed. "If you'll feed them, I'll work for what we take." A long silence. Then the door creaked open. He stepped out like he hadn't been born from a house, but from the earth itself. Tall, broad, bareheaded in the sun, with skin the color of burnt clay, and eyes like winter creek water still sharp and cold. A scar ran down the left side of his neck. His boots were worn raw at the edges. He said nothing, didn't even blink. Miriam's throat tightened, but she didn't drop her gaze. She didn't flinch when he walked past her, slow and silent, like a man used to making others nervous just by breathing. He stopped in front of the boys. Jesse stared up, one hand on Sam's shoulder, like he might need to shield him. Sam looked too tired to be scared. The man crouched, eyes level with the child's. Still not a word. He reached out a hand. Sam hesitated. Then slowly he took it. The man lifted the boy into his arms, no grunt, no strain, and turned back toward the cabin. He didn't look at Miriam. He just left the door open. She followed, one hand holding Jesse's, the other wiping dust and quiet tears from her cheek. Inside, the cabin was sparse. 1 cot, 1 iron stove, a stack of firewood. The smell of tobacco and cedar and something faintly sweet, apple maybe, or memory. The man set Sam gently on the cot, handed Jesse a canteen from the table, and walked back outside. Miriam didn't sit. She stood by the stove, hands folded again, unsure whether she'd been accepted or tolerated. She didn't know his name yet, but she'd just walked 8 miles with nothing but 2 sons and the last of her bread to make a bargain with a ghost. And the ghost had let them in. Miriam woke before the first coyote called. The light hadn't crept past the horizon yet, but the cold had. Her bones ached from the wooden floor. She'd let the boys take the cot. Jesse had refused at first, trying to act grown, but she'd insisted. Sam curled into his older brother's side like he was still in the womb, safe from the world, if only for a few more hours. She sat up slowly. The cabin was still save for the faint tick of a tin clock on the shelf. No sign of the man, not a footstep, not a breath, just a folded note on the table. Wood by the door, pots clean, do what you came to do. No name, no signature, just the words. Miriam set the kettle to boil, then got to work. She scrubbed the floor first, with rainwater from the barrel and a rag that used to be the hem of her skirt. The dust came up in waves, years of it pressed deep into the corners. She cleaned until her arms shook. Then she patched the curtains with bits of cloth from her sack. She found a bucket of lard in the cellar and used a touch to grease the stove hinges. By the time the sun broke through the clouds and caught the edge of the windowsill, the cabin smelled faintly of ash soap and fresh air. Jesse stirred. Sam followed, rubbing his eyes with balled fists. "Where is he?" Jesse asked. "Out," Miriam said, handing him a cup of warm water. "Doing whatever it is men like him do before the world wakes up." They ate a quiet breakfast, just dry oats and a slice of leftover bread from yesterday warmed on the stove, but it felt like something solid, something earned. By midday, Elias returned. He didn't knock, just opened the door, stepped in and stood there for a long moment, like he wasn't sure he had walked into the same house. His coat was flecked with dirt, his boots caked in dried mud. He dropped a sack of dried beans and 2 split logs by the stove. He nodded once, not to her, just to the space between them. And then he left again. Sam watched from the window. "Is he mean?" Miriam shook her head. "He's just quiet." Jesse didn't say anything, but his jaw was tight. He'd heard the stories too. Everyone in Dry Willow had. That afternoon, a rider passed through, dust on his boots, news on his tongue. Miriam was hanging laundry by the back line when she overheard the voice drift from the road. "Cross took in a widow, they say. 2 kids, no ring, no papers. Guess the cabin ain't so haunted after all." The words hit harder than she expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were right. She was a widow, though no court had ever said so, and she had no papers, no deed, no certificate, no safe past to prove she belonged anywhere. Later that week, word reached town proper, and that's when Silas Vane came sniffing. Silas had once tried to buy her late husband's family farm for 1/10 of its worth, only to be blocked by Miriam's refusal to sign over the land. He never forgave her, and he certainly hadn't forgotten. When he heard she'd taken shelter on Cross Ridge, he filed a formal complaint with the town council. Squatting with a wanted man, he told the clerk. Could be endangering minors, too. Never know with those types. Cross ain't even his real name. Probably stole the land to begin with. He folded the paper with a flourish and tipped his hat smug as a preacher with a secret. Back at the cabin, Miriam found a single feather on the windowsill, black with white stripes, maybe left by a hawk, maybe not. She didn't mention the rider, didn't tell the boys about the complaint, but that night as she swept the hearth, she whispered aloud for no one but herself. "I've slept beside ghosts and worse, Mr. Cross. If you'll let me stay, I'll weather whatever storm follows." And from the porch, barely audible over the wind, came his first reply since day one. "So will I." The third frost hadn't melted when Miriam found the ledger. It was tucked inside an old pine box beneath the cellar stairs, hidden behind crates of dried apples and a chipped butter churn. She hadn't been looking for trouble, just flour, but the top corner of the box had split and a few curled papers poked out like they wanted to be seen. She hesitated. Curiosity had cost her before. Still she reached in. Inside were yellowed deeds, folded notes, and ink-stained maps. Some marked with initials she couldn't decipher. Others had the old Choctaw agency seal faded but unmistakable. At the very bottom lay a thick envelope sealed with wax so brittle it cracked when she touched it. She laid it out on the table upstairs, careful not to disturb the boys, who were shaping mud animals by the hearth. Her hands shook a little, not from fear, but something older, a knowing that once certain things are read, they can't be unread. The first page was a land grant, issued by the U.S. government under the Dawes Act, the recipient Elijah Greyfeather Cross. Miriam blinked. She whispered the name aloud. Elijah rolling the syllables like stones on her tongue. It fit him more than Elias ever had. Greyfeather, a name that spoke of wind and winter and long memories. But what stunned her wasn't just the name, it was the date. The deed had been granted to Elijah's father nearly 20 years ago. It bore the Choctaw name filed and recognized under federal record, but never recorded in Dry Willow's courthouse. Probably because no one ever asked the tribe, or maybe they just didn't want to. Underneath the grant was a tax receipt, hand-signed by Judge Albee himself, dated 6 years prior, The year before the courthouse fire that swallowed a decade of records. Miriam exhaled slowly, so that's why they'd never been able to take this ridge from him. Legally, it was his, not borrowed, not squatted his, not under the cross name the town whispered, but under the one they tried to ignore. She wasn't a lawyer, but she'd lived long enough among men with money and land to know when a document carried weight. This wasn't gossip. This was law. That evening, she waited for Elijah to return. He came at dusk as always, dusty quiet, a rabbit slung over his shoulder. He stepped through the door, pausing only when he saw the open box on the table. "You went looking," he said. Not angry, just there. "I was looking for flowers," she replied, then held up the deed. "This found me instead." He didn't reach for it, didn't move. "I wasn't prying," she said more gently, "but this could settle things." Vane filed a complaint. "I heard it from the seamstress's boy who rides the road. He's stirring up the town." Elijah set the rabbit down slow. "He's been stirring for years." "I know," she nodded, "but he can't undo this. You should take it in. File it proper, under your father's name." He finally stepped forward and glanced at the paper. For a moment, Miriam thought as he might fold it, tuck it away, pretend none of it mattered. But he didn't. He stared at it like a man staring into a mirror he hadn't seen in years. "That name," he murmured. "Got folks whipped when I was a boy. Got 'em passed over, laughed at. It also got this land," she said softly. "And your father meant for you to have it." Elijah didn't reply. But the next morning before the frost lifted, he packed the box onto his saddle and rode toward town. Jesse watched from the porch. "You think he's coming back?" Miriam placed a hand on his shoulder. "He's not the kind that runs, just the kind that waits till he's ready." Inside, Sam blew softly into the wooden whistlezod Elijah had carved the night before. It made a high, sweet sound, thin but brave. And somewhere down the road, a man was riding with a name he'd stopped running from. The bell rang just past noon, clear and bold, like it remembered what it was made for. Dry Willow's Founders' Day picnic wasn't fancy, but it was tradition. Ladies in gingham dresses set pies on long tables beneath the cottonwoods. Children chased each other between the church and the well pump. Old-timers dusted off their hats and tried not to argue over who really founded the town. Miriam hadn't planned on going. She hadn't stepped foot in a churchyard since her husband's burial back in Kansas. But Jesse had asked quiet hopeful, and Sam had tugged at her sleeve when he saw the other children walking toward town with baskets and ribbons. So, she'd packed what she had, a small loaf of sourdough, a pot of stew seasoned with salt. She'd traded for eggs and 2 tin plates. Elijah hadn't said a word when she left, just handed her a jar of wild honey and said, "For the bread." The boys carried the basket between them. Miriam walked behind, eyes lowered, breath tight. They reached the square to a hush louder than any shout. Conversations paused, heads tilted. Folks moved aside, not mean, just uncertain. The preacher nodded stiffly. The town seamstress gave a faint smile before turning away. Miriam found a bare patch at the end of the food table and set down her offerings without fuss. "Stay near," she told the boys. "Don't run far." She didn't look up when whispers started. "Is that her?" Thought she was just a rumor. Heard she sleeps in Cross's cabin. Unmarried. No kin. Just showed up. Miriam didn't answer. Just ladled stew into chipped bowls, offering them to anyone who wandered close. Most didn't. A girl, small dirt smudged alone, watched from behind the church steps, hands clenched around her elbows. Miriam caught her gaze, then quietly carried a bowl over and set it down beside her. "It's warm," she said gently. "You don't have to say thank you." The girl didn't, but she ate every bite. Miriam was walking back when the mood shifted. Voices rose, sharp, male. At the edge of the square, Elijah had arrived on foot, no rifle sleeves rolled. His hair was damp like he'd washed it special. Miriam felt her throat tighten, not because he looked dangerous, but because he didn't. He looked deliberate, present. Silas Vane had spotted him, and he wasn't wasting the opportunity. "Well, well," Silas said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Didn't think ghosts showed up to picnics." Elijah didn't answer, just kept walking. "You bring your squatter with you," Silas continued. "Woman like that, no papers, no husband, probably stole those boys. I hear there's a judge somewhere still waiting on proof she even exists." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Miriam stopped beside the table. Jesse's hand found hers. Sam hid behind her skirt. Elijah finally halted. His voice was even. "Careful who you accuse," Silas sneered. "Careful's for men with clean ledgers." A tense silence followed. Then came a voice from the side. "Funny thing," said a deep, gravelly drawl. "You talk a lot about clean ledgers, Silas, for a man who forgot to pay me for 6 wagon wheels last spring." All heads turned. Nathan Hale, the town blacksmith, stepped forward, arms crossed over his chest. His face was soot-streaked, his hands thick with callus. He'd served with Elijah once during the rail line skirmishes. That much Miriam had overheard in passing. Silas sputtered. "That's got nothing to do with—" "It's got everything to do with it," Nathan cut in. "You want to talk about thieves? Let's open your books. I got 3 farmers and a widow saying you twisted their deeds same as hers." The crowd shifted, uncertain, uneasy. Miriam said nothing, just kept her hand steady on Jesse's shoulder. Silas backed away. His smile cracked and false. "This ain't over." "No," Elijah said calmly. "It never is." He turned to Miriam and gave the faintest nod. "Ready." She picked up the basket. "Yes." They walked home through whispers, but not all of them were cruel. Some were wondering. And that was how change always started in a place like Dry Willow. The ride into town wasn't long, but it felt like miles. Elijah wore his good shirt, the one Miriam had stitched a new cuff on, quiet as always while saddling the horse. Jesse had offered to ride with him, but Elijah shook his head. Not this time. He carried the old pine box with the deed, the tax slip, and every page bearing the Greyfeather name. He returned just before sundown. Elijah tried dousing what he could with a water bucket, but the fire had caught too quick, too deliberate. There were no lightning strikes, no candles left burning. Miriam saw the goat still inside and screamed, "No," but it was too late. Elijah stopped her from running in his arm iron across her chest. "Too far," he said, voice hoarse from smoke. Jessie clung to her face streaked with ash. Sam sobbed into her skirt. They watched the barn collapse in on itself. Sparks flew into the night like angry fireflies. The air stank of scorched pine, old hay, and something bitter loss. No one came to help. No one rode up the hill or sent word. Dry Willow had seen the fire. They just chose to look away. By morning, nothing remained but the charred frame and a blackened patch of earth. Elijah didn't say a word, just grabbed a spade and started digging. Miriam stayed silent too. She helped clear the debris, kept the boys back, and folded the singed remains of the feed sacks without letting her hands shake. When Elijah finally laid the little goat in the hole and covered it with the last shovelful of earth, Sam knelt beside the grave and whispered something no one else could hear. That night, there was no stew, no carved animals, no music from the wooden whistle. But in the morning, beside the boy's pallet sat a small whittled flute, and beneath it a carved wooden whistle, just like the first, but this one bore the faint outline of a goat's face burned into the side. The boys didn't say anything, neither did Elijah. But Miriam laid her hand on his as he passed the table and held it just a second longer than she ever had. "I know who did this," she said quietly. He didn't answer, but the hard set of his jaw told her he did too. They didn't speak of vengeance, they just started rebuilding, together. And that afternoon, while the sun hung high and silent, Elijah measured the ground where the new barn would stand. He drove the first stake deep into the earth and stepped back. Then he drew a line in the dirt, not as a warning, but as a promise. The frost was thick that morning, thicker than usual for late fall, hanging in sheets across the grass and glazing the porch railings with a thin coat of white. Miriam's breath curled like smoke as she stepped outside, wrapped in Elijah's old coat, her boots crunching over the frostbitten earth. The boys were still asleep. She'd risen early, half from habit, half from the weight in her chest that hadn't eased since the barn fire. Inside the cabin smelled of yeast and ash. The dough had risen overnight in a cast-iron bowl by the hearth. She turned it out onto the floured table, kneading it slow and steady. The rhythm calmed her. So did the crackle of the wood stove, the flicker of firelight, and the way the silence between her and Elijah had settled into something less jagged. She'd just slid the loaf into the oven when she heard hoofbeats. One horse, maybe two, then the sharp jangle of spurs on wood. She opened the door then to find Sheriff Prentice standing on the porch dust, on his coat warrant in hand. "Elijah Cross," he said, voice tight. Elijah stepped out from the barn's skeleton sleeves, rolled to his elbows, hands marked with soot and splinters. "That's me," he said. The sheriff nodded. "I've got papers here. Accusations of land misrepresentation under the Choctaw name and unlawful care of minors under your roof." Miriam stiffened. "They're not orphans," she said quickly. "They're mine." "Your claim's under review," Prentice replied, not unkindly but firm. "The complaint came in from the town council. Silas Vane's name's on it." Of course it was. Elijah didn't flinch. "The deed's filed." "Not in question," Prentice said. "But until the circuit judge reviews it, I've orders to bring you both in." Jessie stepped onto the porch behind Miriam. "What's going on?" "Back inside," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "No," Elijah said, turning to the boy. "Stay there." Miriam took a deep breath. "Can I bring something for the boys?" The sheriff hesitated. "Quickly." She went back inside and packed a satchel with biscuits, a jar of apple preserves, and Sam's whistle. Then she folded a quilt around both boys and kissed the top of Jessie's head. "Take care of your brother." "Where are you going?" Jessie asked, trying to sound braver than he felt. "We'll be back before supper," she lied. They rode side by side, hands bound, but heads held high through the center of Dry Willow. Folks stared. A few whispered. One man spit near their boots, then ducked behind the mercantile window. The seamstress, Mrs. Tully, stepped forward from her porch with a tin of warm biscuits. She didn't say a word, just handed them to Jessie, who clutched Sam's hand like it was the only thing tethering him to the earth. At the jailhouse, Elijah didn't speak until the door closed behind them. Then he looked the sheriff square in the eye and said, "You'd best check the courthouse deed box." "Bottom drawer." Prentice frowned. "What's their proof?" "And if I don't find it," Elijah didn't blink, "you will." He was placed in a cell without ceremony. Miriam was given a wooden bench outside the holding room. The windows were cracked, letting in the cold. She pulled her shawl tighter and stared at her hands, worn chapped and still dusted with flour. "I made bread this morning," she murmured. "First time it rose just right." Elijah sat on the cot across the bars. "We'll get back to it." Miriam let herself believe it for just a moment. And down the street under a quilt on the mercantile's back steps, two boys shared warm biscuits with the seamstress, who told them stories about brave women and stubborn men, and how sometimes the law was slower than it should be, but truth had a way of catching up. Dry Willow had never seen so many wagons parked outside the church. It wasn't Sunday, and there was no funeral, but word traveled faster than truth in a town like this, and the prospect of seeing Elijah cross and the widow face judgment had drawn half the county from their stoves and sheds. Inside the church, the pews creaked beneath heavy coats and heavier opinions. A hush hung over the room, broken only by the steady click of Judge Albie's cane as he was helped to the front. The man was old now, near blind, but still sharp enough to know when justice was being twisted into spectacle. Miriam sat near the front, hands folded in her lap. Her dress was clean but faded. She'd braided her hair back tight and plain. Elijah sat beside her, jaw-clenched eyes steady on the floorboards. No chains today, just scrutiny. Sheriff Prentice stood near the altar reading from the writ with a voice that tried for neutral but faltered around Silas Vane's name. The charges he began are unlawful habitation endangerment of minors and fraudulent land possession under tribal pretense. Murmurs rose. Judge Albie held up one liver-spotted hand. "Let's get to the proof," he rasped. Miriam stood. She didn't make speeches, just stepped forward and laid 3 papers on the church podium like she was setting a table for company. "This," she said, "is the original land grant issued to Elijah Greyfeather Cross under his father's Choctaw name, recognized under federal treaty." She placed the second sheet. "This is the tax receipt signed by your own hand, Judge Albie, the year before the courthouse fire." And finally, the third. "This is a letter from the Choctaw agency notarized confirming Elijah's identity and lineage." She stepped back. The room was quiet enough to hear the wind tapping the windows. Silas Vane stood red-faced. Those documents could be forged. Judge Albie looked toward him without turning his head. "Silas, I may be nearly blind, but I still recognize my own signature." A few scattered chuckles. Silas sat down fast, and the children the judge asked, voice softer now. Miriam hesitated. She turned toward the pews, toward Jessie and Sam, who sat flanked by the town seamstress, and Nathan Hale, the blacksmith. Sam held his carved goat whistle in his lap. Jessie held his brother's hand. "They are my sons," Miriam said, her voice firm. "By birth, by blood, and by every morning I've gotten up to keep them fed." Someone near the back cleared their throat, then coughed like they regretted interrupting. "I have no papers," she admitted. "I had no one left to vouch for me. but I brought bread to this town when I had nothing left but crust. I've swept floors, patched shirts, cooked meals, and asked for nothing but a roof. And Elijah has given them more care than men twice his age who never saw war loss or prejudice. Judge Albee let the silence stretch as if weighing each word on a scale only he could see. At last he spoke. The arrest was unlawful. The deed stands. The children stay. There was no applause, just a long exhale like the church itself had been holding its breath. Silas Vane stormed out without a word. Outside, the sky had turned a brighter blue. Cold still clung to the air, but Miriam felt something shift in her bones, like the ridge had settled beneath her feet. Jessie tugged on her sleeve. "Does this mean we get to go home?" She smiled. "It means we have a home." Elijah didn't say anything. He just touched the brim of his hat and nodded once toward the judge. As they walked down the church steps, Judge Albee leaned toward Sheriff Prentice and murmured, "A woman who gives bread when she has none is already their mother." And Dry Willow, for the first time in a long while, had nothing left to argue with. 3 days after the hearing, the wind changed. Not the kind that stirred leaves or rattled shutters. This one came from people, from town. A shift so slow it might have gone unnoticed if you weren't looking for it. But Miriam noticed. At the Mercantile, the clerk didn't turn his back when she walked in. He nodded, didn't smile, but didn't shut the door either. Jessie held it open behind her, proud like he'd built it himself. They bought sugar flour and a spool of blue thread. "Elijah likes blue," Jessie whispered. Outside, Nathan Hale waved from the blacksmith shop. And across the street, Mrs. Tully was hanging a quilt from her porch rail when she called out, "If your boy wants to learn how to stitch straight, send him by after schoolin'." Miriam blinked at the offer, warmth catching her by surprise. That afternoon she brought the flour home and started another loaf. This one for the blacksmith's table. Elijah had already been out rebuilding barn frame, half-raised hands, scraped shoulders tight with purpose. The boys were helping where they could, carrying nails and old coffee tins and dragging beams from the pile. Sam carried more sawdust than wood, but Elijah never corrected him, just let him try. Later that night, Elijah sat at the table carving again. He hadn't said what he was making. Miriam didn't ask. Some things bloomed better in silence. But what none of them knew, not until the sheriff showed up at the ridge the next morning, was what had been happening in town. Sheriff Prentice arrived without his badge pinned. That alone made Miriam pause at the door. He took off his hat. "Can we talk?" Elijah set down his hammer. "Got a letter," the sheriff said, "from the state banking board." He handed over a folded paper, with the seal still drying. "They're opening an investigation into Silas Vane, misuse of town funds, forged loan agreements, altered land documents going back 10 years. Miriam felt her knees go soft. "How?" Elijah asked. Turns out Prentice said some of those folks he swindled finally spoke up. "And that copy of your deed. It had enough weight to make the board look twice. Once the judge vouched for it, others came forward." "Is he arrested?" Miriam asked. "Stripped of his license, pending full inquiry." "He's gone for now. Took the East Trail yesterday before sunrise." Elijah nodded once. "Cowards always run when they lose the pin." The sheriff lingered. "You ever think about putting up a sign for the place? You built it up enough?" Miriam looked at Elijah, then at the cabin, the rebuilt porch, the rising barn frame. Later that afternoon, while the boys collected wildflowers and Elijah hung the last beam, she rummaged through the old pine box, the one that once held forgotten papers and history no one dared speak. She found a piece of cedar and set to carving. Her hands weren't practiced, but her touch was sure. By sundown, they stood by the new barn. The sign was rough but bold. Burned letters that read, "Cross and Ames, no one hungry here." Elijah stepped back studying it. "You sure about both names?" he asked. Miriam looked at her sons, then at the hills that held them. "I didn't come here for a name," she said, "but I think I earned one." He handed her the hammer. "Then you should drive the nail." She did, 2 taps firm and steady. The boys clapped. Sam handed her a dandelion. Jessie just grinned like the wind had shifted for good. The next week, the blacksmith's family started buying bread from her. The seamstress brought fabric scraps for the boys. And each evening, Elijah carved by the fire, one eye on the boys, the other on the woman who no longer stood on his porch as a guest. She stood as partner, and not one soul in Dry Willow dared call her the widow again. By spring, the creek thawed, and the ridge turned green again. Wildflowers pushed through cracked fence lines, and the wind no longer bit it, hummed. Bees returned to the clover patch by the barn, and the smell of yeast and smoke drifted from the cabin most mornings, signaling something warm was rising on more than just the stove. Miriam stood at the kitchen table kneading dough, while Sam painted butter on the last loaf. Jesse was outside helping Elijah set the final fence post around their garden plot. "You think the carrots will come up straight this year?" Sam asked, brows furrowed with concern. Only a 6-year-old could carry. Miriam smiled. "If they don't, we'll just call 'em Curly and pretend that's how we wanted 'em." He grinned and nodded, satisfied with her answer. Out back, Elijah tapped the final post into place and leaned on it, shoulders relaxed. Jesse held the nails in a coffee tin, watching the line stretch along the ridge, straight, strong, and theirs. "Think it'll hold?" Jesse asked. "It's not about holdin'," Elijah said, wiping his brow. "It's about markin' what's worth guardin'." They stood a while in quiet before heading in. Inside, the cabin had grown full not just with bread and carved things, but with something steadier. The kind of peace that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just stays. Later that evening, after supper, and the boys tucked in, Miriam found 2 small figures on the table, carved from walnut, smooth and warm to the touch. One was a large wolf head, lifted jaw strong. The other, smaller, stood beside it, slightly turned, as if listening for danger. Miriam picked them up, running her thumb across the fine grooves Elijah had shaped, with patience and care. "They're beautiful," she whispered. He shrugged, like it meant nothing, though his eyes said otherwise. "Thought they'd like something to keep. Wolves don't need herdin', they watch their own." She set them back down gently. "You carved them for the boys, but they look like you." "And you," he said simply. The fire crackled low behind them. "You ever want someone to stay?" she asked after a long pause, her voice quiet but steady. Elijah didn't answer right away. He stared at the wolves, then at the ridge beyond the window, at the life they'd built from dust and hardship, bread and silence. "I want someone who already has," he said. Miriam looked down at her flour-dusted hands, then back at him. "Then I'll keep making bread." That was her answer. Not romantic, not poetic, just true. He smiled, the faintest curve of his lips, then nodded once. Outside, the night settled over Cross Ridge like a quilt. Jesse and Sam lay curled under patched blankets, the carved wolves placed proudly on their bedside table. The barn stood rebuilt, the fence posts aligned. The garden beds were tilled and ready, and over the new porch door hung the wooden sign worn now by sun and wind, cross and Ames. "No one hungry here." By the end of the week, the boys had helped raise a chicken coop, hammering the last nail into place with more enthusiasm than skill. Elijah didn't correct their crooked corners. Miriam didn't fuss over the paint strokes. It stood, and that was enough. Neighbors came by more often, sometimes with eggs, sometimes just to sit. A man with a fiddle showed up on Sunday and played while Miriam served warm sourdough with honey. No one asked how it started. No one brought up Silas Vane. Because what mattered most wasn't the trouble that brought her to the ridge, but what she chose to build once she got there. And in Dry Willow, where names were often whispered before being earned, the name Cross and Ames became something spoken out loud and with respect. If you've ever built something from near nothing, if you've known that kind of quiet love, the kind carved in wood and baked in bread, drop a comment below and tell us where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the frontier.